it was amazing to me to see what happened when people, one, were given a tangible next step, and two, the kind of transformation that happened in individuals and a community's life when they made it a point to live out these things together.
Welcome to the Everywhere Podcast, a collection of interviews with leaders and pastors and everyday followers of Jesus who are living into the reality that Jesus changes everything, everywhere. Hey there, I'm Ryan. Today I have the privilege of sitting down with Pastor Michaele LaVigne. It's been such an honor to get to know Pastor Michaele. I first met her when she was a speaker at our Chicago Central District teen camp. And it was really interesting because she was the first teen camp speaker who I'd ever seen take students through Lectio Divina and some other practices during camp. It was a really powerful experience, and I was like, I've got to get to know her. And man, I was not disappointed. And I found out that as I was getting to know her, it had dawned on me that I'd already actually read a book that she had written called Living the Way of Jesus, Practicing the Christian Calendar 1 Week at a Time, which is a really powerful book. I really think you should get it if you get a chance. Anyway, our conversation covers her journey of faith story, her call to ministry, and also just her years in ministry. She served at Bethany First Church and then was a part of a church plant as well called 8th Street Church in Oklahoma, and also her time that she spent in Africa. It was just a fantastic conversation. I think you're going to love it. So let's check it out. Well, hello there, Pastor Michaele LaVigne. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's good to see you. We met at the Chicago Central District's teen camp, where initially, kind of looking back at it now, you were maybe a little bit of an unlikely speaker for a teen camp as we're diving into spiritual formation and devotionals and times of silence. And I just have to say, it was a powerful experience for me and our students. And I know all the students and pastors there. So it was a really special time.
Well, thank you. I have spoken at teen camp one other time. And in both instances, when people approached me, I was like, well, let me tell you what I do. And you can tell me if you think it's, because I'm not, yeah, you're right. I'm not the regular teen speaker persona.
Yeah, but it worked well though.
But I do think that our young people are interested in a deeper way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I love having conversations with young people about, they have great questions and great insights, and they are really hungry and thirsty for the real thing. And so, why would we wait to give it to them?
Amen to that. I kept thinking, I was like, I kind of wish every camp was like this. Times for students just to sit and pray and read and use their imagination. And they're literally spoon-fed every other thing. So why not make time for Jesus? It was great. With that said, so let's just dive right in. What's your faith story? What's your coming to faith story?
I was born into faith. And of course, made it my own at some point. But my parents were in traveling evangelism ministry when I was growing up. My dad was in seminary when I was born. And so a lot of my faith journey has been impacted by their faith journey, of course, and their particularly call into ministry and responding to God's call as that changed in various iterations in their life. And I was firstborn and there to watch it all and participate in all of it. And so at first, we traveled around and my dad was preaching. My parents did music and drama together in various churches and camps during the summer. So I grew up at teen camp, actually, quite a lot. I was was in teen camps a lot, and was homeschooled then. And my dad had seen other, ministers travel without their families, and kind of the harm that that caused in many cases. And it was like, I don't think if we're going to do this, we're going to do it together. So it was a family commitment. And again, I think that also really shaped my own experience of God and church and being faithful to the call. And then when I was in middle school, we stopped traveling and settled down in my dad's hometown in northeastern Ohio for him to plant a church. And again, kind of embarked on that as a family journey. And I was there through graduating high school, went to Mount Vernon Nazarene University, and knew like pretty much my whole adolescence that I was doing something in the church, that I would do something in ministry. But for whatever reason, just really struggled with naming that as a call, quote unquote, to pastoral ministry specifically. And so it took most of my time in college to sort that out, and then went on from there into seminary, also in Ohio at Ashland Theological Seminary. And I think eventually I recognized a similar thing that I had watched in my dad and my parents in particular, where, you say yes to God with a lot of like caveats and disclaimers, and you're like, okay, I've made peace. I can do this thing. I'm saying yes to this thing. And this one little, I'll go this far, God. And then during seminary, I is when I really felt the Lord say, you, especially wrestling through, the scriptures about women in ministry. And that was never an issue for me necessarily, because, in the Nazarene church, that's commonplace, but making sense of it with scripture and, all of that was an important part of my seminary journey. And so through that, I felt the Lord say to me, Michaele, you're really the only one limiting what you will allow me to ask you to do. And maybe you should stop.
Just stop right now.
Just stop trying to put a lid on it and just let me take you where we're going to go. And so the Lord and I have had that conversation many times, but it comes back to that moment of like, oh yeah, I'm not in charge of this thing.
Talk a little bit about how you came to that place of reconciling the call with what you're seeing in scripture. Because it's still a conversation. I'm not sure why it's still a conversation, but it's still a conversation that people are wrestling with and can't quite land there.
Yeah, I think for me, coming into my own experience of being called, it wasn't so much about what scripture said, but it was about what culture was modeling. And I trusted implicitly that the Lord could call and use whomever the Lord wanted to call and use. But I did not see that lived out. I didn't see a lot of women leading and preaching. My own family, was very encouraging and, affirmed gifts that they saw in me, but I didn't see that happening anywhere else. Not that people weren't affirming of me, but I didn't see any other women doing what it felt like I was being called or led to do. So I think recognizing that was a big step as well, and recognizing that just because the church has not always done a good job of living into our theology doesn't mean that that's the way it should be. That the church doesn't always get it right, and there's room for growth. And so the scriptural part, I think, was more about, really diving into that, was more about growing in a sense of confidence that the naysayers and the people who were just kind of stuck in a mentality, could be not argued with necessarily, but there was something there to address these issues, and that wasn't the end all be all of the conversation. And honestly, I think still to this day that the biggest scriptural reference that we have in terms of women being called and ordained to proclaim the gospel is Jesus sending Mary of Magdala to be the very first evangelist and proclaimer of the resurrection. And I just don't think we can take that lightly. I don't think we can step away from that. I also think it's really fascinating, though, that built in with that, there was an assumption that she was not believed. Mm. And so I think it's also helped me to be at peace with knowing that I'm not necessarily called to make anyone believe anything, or that it's not on me. Like, my definition of success is not what other people do with what I tell them, but it's about whether or not I'm being faithful to do what God's asked me to do, and then, leave the rest.
I've had several conversations just in the last month around the idea of women understanding, listen, I get the fact that there's a role and that scripture affirms to a degree, and for what we can see, that women can be pastors and preach and teach and all the things. Not interested in the conversation about the role. I want to see it happening.
Yeah.
And so what you just said, man, that has hit home for me in the last month of just like, I get that there's a role. You don't have to argue that point. The issue is we don't see it that often. And we don't see it lived out in a way where there's not these little hooks and hangups and, little caveats here or there. It's like, no, it's just fully lived out. It's not a conversation. We're just doing it. And
so it's not a theoretical or hypothetical proposition, right? Yeah. It is actually like practical, lived out. How are we going to be a different kind of people that doesn't play by the same roles of gender and hierarchy and power? How are we going to actually live into the truth of what we have been given? And so to me, because of that, the issue of women in ministry and women being ordained for ministry is actually a gospel imperative. It is part and parcel of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. It's all about freedom and breaking down barriers that humans have constructed to say who's in and who's out and who's privileged and who's not. And if we understand the gospel as anything other than that, I think it's really dangerous territory.
Thank you for that. So your early years in ministry, talk about your first church you served and how that went, what it was like.
Yeah, so I was able to be an intern when I was a senior in college there in Mount Vernon at a little New Start congregation, and stayed on as an associate pastor while I was in seminary. And it was a very incarnational model of ministry. We were a people that lived in the west end of Mount Vernon, which is kind of literally the other side of the tracks in Little Mount Vernon, Ohio. It's a very economically depressed neighborhood. I would often say it's a blue collar to no collar neighborhood.
That's good.
And so when my husband and I moved into the neighborhood, we were both in master's degrees. We were married, in our early 20s, and we were such an anomaly. We were like such an anomaly. We would have kids come, like high school and, oh, sorry, my phone down. We were, trying to minister to middle school and high schoolers. And I remember these young ladies coming in and being like, so what does your boyfriend do or whatever? And I was like, oh, he's my husband. Oh, you got kids somewhere? No, we don't have any kids. You're married, but you don't have a baby? Like there was all these things that like we were wrecking the way things went in their lives. But it opened up so many amazing conversations, and it just allowed us to say, we're here because we want to love you. And I learned so much during that period of my life. I learned so much. I learned a lot about poverty. I learned a lot about how my paradigms for discipleship often were, based in middle classdom more than anything else, and had to rethink a lot of, was I wanting to disciple these young people into the way of Jesus, or was I trying to disciple them into being middle class Americans? And sorting through, expectations and what it meant to love open-handedly, and learn how to set boundaries, and also simultaneously try to learn how with my lead pastor to set vision for a group of people who did not look like our neighbors, but wanted to love our neighbors well. And it was, it was the perfect real world counterpart to my seminary experiences, and learning, all of the theory and the language and the theology, which I totally loved. But then it was like, if that stuff can't make some kind of difference in this environment, then what's the point? So it was, I still look back and glean things from those early days for sure.
And eventually it led you to Bethany Church. Talk about your journey there.
So I don't know if we even got to talk about this when we were at camp together, but we came from Ohio to Oklahoma by way of a year in Africa.
No, we did not talk about that. Let's talk about that for sure. That's not a trek. Most people make a year in Africa.
When we both finished our master's programs, Brent was in business and I was, an MDiv, Master of Divinity. We hadn't miraculously, God just provided some amazing things. So at that point in our lives, neither of us had to go in debt for our master's degrees.
Awesome.
And we didn't own a house, and we had paid off cars, and we had zero debt. And we were like, man, when is this ever going to happen in our lives? We don't have kids, we don't have debt. And we had always said we wanted to live a year overseas. So we tried, looking around for a way to be volunteer missionaries with the Church of the Nazarene. And that search, we were kind of specific in that we wanted to be a part of something that was going to outlast our time there, and something that we could use our gifts in doing. And it took a while to find the right place, but eventually we got connected with what was then called the Swaziland Partnership. And it was in its very early days. Dr. David Busick was at that time pastor of Bethany First Church and in Oklahoma. And Bethany First Church, under his leadership and the neighboring, Nazarene University, Southern Nazarene University, entered into a partnership together to strengthen the institutions of the Church of the Nazarene in Swaziland, which that nation has now been renamed Eswatini, by the way. But so at that time it was Swaziland, now it's Eswatini. But at that point, this was 2008, I guess, when the partnership began. And we were there in 2009 and 2010. And in those early days, this tiny nation of just over 1 million people had the highest HIV/AIDS rate per capita of any place in the world.
Oh, wow.
It was dire. It was devastating. And so, long story short, we found ourselves on the ground there as what the job title was called on-site coordinators. And so it was our job to just build relationships on the ground in Eswatini, get to know the Swazi leaders, and then try to, build bridges as much as we could for the American side of the partnership, wanting to help. But we did a lot of listening to translate back and forth, like what was really needed. And again, we just learned a whole lot about what it means to be faithful, compassionate people in your own culture. And it was there that I began to kind of similarly to how in Westside, I was distinguishing between discipling people into the way of Jesus and discipling people into middle-class America. In Swaziland or Eswatini, I was beginning to discern, there's a difference between discipling people into the way of Jesus and discipling people into the American church experience.
Mm.
And spending time and being shaped by Christian leaders, courageous, faithful, self-sacrificing people of another culture really challenged me, frankly, and challenged the ways in which, I recognize that we so often put American values front and center, and then we have a tendency to judge the church abroad based on our American values rather than based on the common denominator of the kingdom.
Mm.
So again, just a very transformative experience. And we've been back a couple of times, was able to lead teams, haven't been back since we've had kids. So that's been 8 years, and I'm excited someday to take them with us and introduce them.
That'd be awesome.
But yes, going back to your original question, after our time there was finished, I was invited to come back to Bethany and join the staff of Bethany First Church under Dr. Busick. And then Brent was also offered a job at Southern Nazarene University. So we were there in Oklahoma from 2010 to 2021.
And I want to go back to two things. One, flesh out for me the difference between discipling into middle class America versus what you encountered in Ohio, and also then what you encountered overseas. Tell me what are some of these things that these major differences, because we're all probably guilty. So I'd love to know maybe what I'm missing.
Well, I think the biggest one is around this notion of independence.
Okay.
I, especially in the West End, and to some extent in Africa as well, there was this there was almost this undergirding value of, getting people to be independent, hardworking and contributing members to society. Like get off welfare,
Right.
grow your own, if it's in Swaziland, grow your own food, do things for yourself. And under closer examination, that is actually not a priority for Jesus. Now, Paul begins to talk about, people contributing and not just draining from the community resources. But that's even a little bit different. I mean, that's assuming that the church is already providing for those who do not have. So it's not talking about like, governmental resources. But even more than that, like Jesus said, blessed are the poor.
Right.
And blessed are the hungry and thirsty, and blessed are those who mourn. And I was realizing that my default was working hard at getting people out of any position in which they were poor or hungry or thirsty or mourning. And that it was my job somehow as a Christian minister to fix the problems that made people that way, rather than bring them the radical proclamation that right as they are blessed to be in the presence of God, and they may have a leg up on understanding what it means to receive grace, because those of us who walk around self-sufficiently and independently all the time are at a real disadvantage when it comes to knowing how to receive and depend on God. And I think that is what God cares most about.
It's powerful. When did your love of spiritual formation practices, liturgical elements, really looking back in the churches, was this forming at the same time? Has this always been there? I mean, where did that come into play?
My initial introduction was during college. I was introduced to a prayer book for the very first time.
Oh, wow.
And found it remarkably, and it followed the lectionary calendar. So I learned about, the calendar. I learned about a lot of spiritual authors and writers from, much broader Christian tradition than what I had been exposed to. And they were writing, people like Henry Nouwen and Carlo Coretto, Hannah Whitall Smith, just a smattering of people included in this prayer book. And I was exposed to a deeper encounter with God through their writings. Like I was like, man, they have tasted something. They have experienced something. And I want that. And so I think that imprinted upon me a knowledge that there was a deeper something available, and I just kind of kept after it. So I can't remember when it was. Maybe it was seminary. College and seminary also got introduced to the writings of Dallas Willard.
Oh, yeah.
Foster, who are, within the modern era of the evangelical church in America, really some of the clarion calls to re-engage in classical disciplines and recognizing what is happening within us, and how people actually are changed and transformed by partnering with the Spirit. And so while I was So I all of this was kind of in my periphery and within my own spiritual practice. But after I came to Oklahoma, not long after I moved there, I found out about a workshop that was being offered not far away, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from Renovari. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Renovari
Oh,
organization,
mm-hmm.
but Dallas Willard and Richard Foster actually started that. And now, it's a lot of other people as well, but it's an organization, an ecumenical, mostly evangelical organization, that is just all about giving the church formational practices and keeping, spiritual discipline practices and traditions alive, and making them available for clergy and laity alike. So they write a bunch of books, they offer workshops, they have an email list if anyone listening is interested. It's a phenomenal resource. So I went to this workshop and just was like, man, everything they're saying, I want this. Like, this is just so good. And they at the end said, okay, now if you're if something has resonated with you, here's a couple of next steps. And the first one they said was, you have to find a place of community, because this is not a solo journey. And if you're wanting to take on practices, and take a deeper dive into your own spiritual formation, you're going to need some people to go with you. And so they recommended this resource that I bought as kind of a group guide. And I was really, I was like, okay, I know that this is what I should do, but I don't know how to make it happen, because I'm a new pastor in this very large congregation. And I don't feel like there's anyone that I know or trust. And this was way before Zoom was a thing. There's no one that I know in this area that I trust, or that I would feel like I could ask to do this with me. And so I sat on it for a couple of months, and every time I would see that book, or, it would come up in prayer, and I just kept feeling this nudge, like, this is the next step. You need to do this. And I was kind of just arguing with God about it. And finally I felt the Spirit say, well, are you ever going to ask me who I think you should do this with? And I was like, oh,
That's a thing, right? Yeah, I probably should do that.
So sure. And it was like kind of flippant. I was like, okay, God, sure. Like, who do you have? I'm going to pray about this for 3 more months. And honestly, like, 2 names came to me almost immediately. It was crazy. I still think back to that day, and I'm like, man, the Spirit was teaching me a lot of things that day. And so, that risky act of faith, I reached out to both of these ladies who were also exploring their own calls to ministry and working through the ordination process, but were both part of the church that I was serving at. And each of them were gung-ho, like, I've been wanting something like this, and so we set about meeting weekly. And I said, okay, there's a 9-week curriculum that this book is going to walk us through. There's conversations and questions, and it's like accountability, but not, bury your soul and, whip yourself on the back kind of accountability. At least not quite at the beginning, but it just is like, it helps assess where you are in your formation and what has been forming you. And then at the end of every chapter, it says, okay, now here's some practices to try during this next week to grow into this area. And so I think that was probably my introduction to the way in which practicing something can be so formative. And so we would each take turns and say, okay, here's this list. I'm going to try, reading through the whole book of John this week. I'm going to try 5 minutes of silence. I'm going to try, whatever. And then we would be able to hold one another accountable to that when we gathered the next time, and also be able to say, how did you experience God through this? Or how did you not? Or how did you, how were you not able to do the practice, and what did you learn about yourself even through that? So it was very much like not a performance driven thing, but it felt very much like we were on this journey together. And we were in this pattern of meeting and practicing and praying together almost every single week for like 4 years. It was pretty incredible, the way that we received God's transformation through that time together. And then from there, my own, I started really recognizing the significance of a community of holy conversation and of personal practice. And that informed the way that I pastored and led other people. There's a couple of other really great, so I went to a couple more, seminars and conferences and stuff. And one, a voice that was a part of Renovari and now is doing his own thing, is James Bryan Smith. And he is awesome. A disciple of Richard Foster and Dallas Willard, and has written 3 books called Good and Beautiful God, Good and Beautiful Life, and Good and Beautiful Community. And
got them on the shelf. They're awesome.
Yeah, so good. So good. So there's a whole conference built up around that and his work. And that became kind of the cornerstone for my own work as a discipleship pastor. And he really hones in on this, what he calls the triangle of transformation, which is getting our narratives right, conforming what we believe about God to what Jesus teaches us about God, and confronting the things that are not true that we have just taken as truth. And then surrounding ourselves with community who are doing the same thing, and taking on practices, or he calls them exercises, that help us live into the truth of these new narratives, and then recognizing that the Holy Spirit is in the middle orchestrating all of those things together. And so when it came time for us to, we were, me and another pastor at Bethany First Church were sent off to go start this new congregation in downtown Oklahoma City. And I knew that I wanted these concepts to serve as the backbone of formation and transformation, because if anything was going to happen in people's lives, it was going to be through this. We were going to have to practice what we preach, not just listen to it. And so when we started this new congregation, it wasn't very long. It was just a couple of months before I realized, like, we've put a lot of things in place for the liturgy of the service, the way that we are shaped in worship. And we've put a lot of effort into the way groups are organized and, how that happens. But there felt like a piece missing still, because it was like we have these 2 hours of the week, or, not, groups don't meet every single week. It's like every other week or whatever. But there's this daily element that in between Sundays that was like missing. And so I started kind of thinking back to my own experience and the practices. And so almost on, I won't say a whim, but kind of like as an experiment, I was like, what if I try writing a practice for our congregation so that they have something tangible to do with the sermon that they hear on Sunday? And so as part of the benediction, as part of the end of the service, we are sent with a practice to go do something with what we've heard in the week. And lo and behold, people actually started doing them.
Chuck.
Totally different thing. I mean, I was just kind of blown away by this. We built it into the fabric of, we talk about it in our small groups, or we call them parish groups. And so there was kind of an expectation built around it that people would at least know what they were and give it a try. But it was amazing to me to see what happened when people, one, were given a tangible next step. And two, the kind of transformation that happened in individuals and a community's life when they made it a point to live out these things together. And I think that has been a significant piece of shaping the culture of 8th Street Church. And so those practices then are what led to the creation of the book, Living the Way of Jesus.
So that's really great. All right. So I want to go back. You're on staff at how large was Bethany at that time when you were there?
Probably like 1,500, 1,800, something like that.
You're there as the pastor of discipleship. And then you go and you plant 8th Street. What, I'm going to ask this. The movement of large church program structure, going from that to something maybe a little more incarnational, if we could call it that. There's a lot of people who do the reverse track. Their hungers towards it's very incarnational. I'm helping, but I want to make my way up a different kind of ladder. Talk a little bit about that nature of being a pastor of a large church to something maybe a little more incarnational with what you saw at 8th Street, and what both types of congregations can learn from each other, if that's a helpful question.
Yeah. There was a lot of relearning. There was a lot of relearning. I think, again, as part of our Americanism, we have equated largeness with kingdom success. And I don't think those are always the same thing. In fact, it was evident to us, to me at least, that community, the real kind of people showing up for one another and being the hands and feet of Christ for one another, is actually harder the larger you get. And the kinds of formational work of people being vulnerable with one another and sharing in practices and dialogue with one another, that gets harder the bigger you get. And so there's this whole, kind of push-pull of the church, and particularly the worship experience, as a commodity to be consumed, or a formational event that you participate in. And there are some days that we felt like, we were, oh man, very cringeworthy. Very cringeworthy. And when you're used to the level of production and excellence and things being timed and lights and and the things that we felt like are so normal, it just feels like nails on a chalkboard. But over time, I think excellence is always going to be important. Doing your best is always going to be important. But over time, I think I was able to be shaped quite a bit to recognize that the real gift of Christian community is the space for authenticity. And it doesn't have to be the fact that a good, show value is inauthentic, but it can feel like it's harder to be authentic when there's the pressure of all of those things. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm kind of rambling now.
No, you're not rambling. Because the authenticity, I'm in a smaller church, right? So we're about 100 people or so. And there's always things that you do at every stage of whatever size as a church where you're kind of like, ugh, wish this is better, wish this is better, wish this is better quality, whatever. But I've come to realize that the authenticity of a community of people who come, if their hearts are in the right place and their motivations are right, and they're wanting to worship the Lord, and they're wanting to see people truly discipled, they want to participate with God in the midst of that, God honors that kind of excellence in a way that is pretty profound.
Right.
So no, that was great. The other thing I just have to acknowledge, most of us as pastors, we would immediately go to a conference like what you went to, a workshop rather, take that, and then we would try to programize it, right? We'd be like, oh, I'm going to do a discipleship program, bring some people in, do this thing, everybody come on board. I love the fact that you wrestled, you just knew this is going to have to be a small batch that would then kind of grow out. And then eventually it became the way of a local church. That's very different. My initial reaction is, man, there's a lot of things I probably would have grown better in if I had just allowed that to be about my own formation and not just what I'm going to try to get other people to do.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was really, that's helpful.
I wish I could take credit for that. I don't think that I was thinking about it in that way. I just, honestly, I felt lonely. And I was feeling the limitations of my own, especially coming out of Africa. And it was in many ways this spiritual high experience, and going through culture shock. And I didn't go to that conference like wanting to learn how to be a better pastor or like, how do I do this job well? I went to that conference because I felt like I need something for me. I can tell what I am lacking, and I need something for me. But in hindsight, I think, you're exactly right, that if we give the Holy Spirit enough opportunity to plant something deep within us, and we ourselves experience transformation, it will absolutely find its way out into other people.
Yeah.
It can't not.
Right.
Right. Like, that's just how it works. But I would say the reverse, is just as untrue as that true is. Like, if we try to manufacture something for other people that we ourselves have not experienced, it's not usually going to go so great.
I want to freeze frame that sound. There's so many things I look back over the years and I'm like, oh, it's not good. And it was usually because, I saw something that I liked or that I wanted to be a part of and try to like transplant that to where I was, rather than allowing that planted thing to grow in me, to be in the context of the place I'm in, and to allow God to do whatever it is he's going to do in and through that, with all those elements there. Okay, so where are you now? So you were at 8th Street, and then I imagine an incredibly difficult call to leave there. Well, actually, let's actually start there, and then we'll kind of move into that other question. 8th Street Church, what'd you experience there over your years there, and then where are you now?
My gosh,
Yeah.
how do I give a synopsis of what I experienced there? So 8th Street was the move from Bethany First Church to 8th Street was a lot of things. It was a move from a large established suburban church, for one.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a move from people. Part of the established church is that you have generations of saints, right? People who know the truth and are affirming and loving and tithe and give, over an abundance. I mean, there's just these generations of faithful love, and man, that they shaped me so much. But even though we were only moving a couple of miles, we moved to downtown, midtown, downtown, and a place of the city where a lot of change and growth was happening very quickly. But also into a community and a kind of milieu of, now it's still the buckle of the Bible Belt. So it's not entirely post-Christian, but more moving that direction. So, people that have never been a part of church, or most people that we encountered actually had some church experience, but it was highly negative church experience, and that they were staying away because of what they had experienced previously or in childhood or whatever. And so it was very much like a missionary kind of sending experience. The cultures were very, very different. And the needs and the desires of people in Midtown were just very, very different, and the lived experiences, all of that stuff. So I think one of our early work was trying to get to the root of what we were called to do, as what does it look like to be faithful embodiment of Christ's kingdom and the church in this place, and what does it look like to be a holiness people in particular. We're Church of the Nazarene in this place, and we landed upon language of that we wanted to be really good neighbors, and so we landed on that language, not even fully knowing where that would take us. But all throughout Scripture, love of neighbor is central. And when you move to a place, and when you put yourself in proximity to be actual neighbors with people who have such different life experiences than you, being a good neighbor takes on a whole lot of meaning that you never knew it had. And so everything from, the very wealthy CEO that bought a $2 million modern home, constructed it from the ground up in our, neighborhood, to the homeless people who sleep on the street in our neighborhood, and everything in between. There's just a tremendous amount of opportunity to learn from one another and learn how to love one another. And so I think more than anything, I was able to witness, and I think the church continues to go in this trajectory of being an ever expanding experience of what it means to love well, and all the surprising places that takes you. and how we really worked to foster a culture of neighborliness within ourselves, so that when people came, they had something to experience within. It wasn't just what are we doing for the people out there? So goodness, yeah, I think I learned and experienced a tremendous amount about how the Spirit leads and guides and transforms, but also at the same time, the importance of leaders and pastors being very intentional with our words, with our shared language, with casting a vision and creating the boundaries of a culture that is going to live into the characteristics that we see. And in that, I think that, again, just like we said with our own individual lives, right? It's more important that we let something take seed in us before we try to share it with other people. I think what I learned as a pastor is that if we do the hard work of creating shared language, shared practices, boundaries to keep us with, operating within our intentions, and we do that hard work of cultivating culture, that shapes character. That is formative to us. That shapes who we are as communal and individual, experience. And it will have transforming, it will be transforming to the individuals, but then it will also impact the way that you conduct yourselves everywhere else, right? Like it starts personal, but then it doesn't stay there. It spreads and it grows. And the work of culture creation, eventually, if you keep on that, that carries your mission forward, really.
Wow. So where are you guys now?
Yeah, so we are currently in South Bend, Indiana. In December of 2021, we moved here. My husband started his new job at Bethel University in neighboring Mishawaka, Indiana, in September of last year. And we had been through, multiple months together of discerning and recognizing that, change was coming. And so when it came time to actually, there was a job offer and came time to say yes, there was a lot of, but I knew it was right. We had already made peace. I mean, we knew, that it was coming, right. But no amount of knowing that it's the right thing can eliminate grief, when you leave people that you love. So that transition was and has been very hard. I tell people that, my son was born in 2014, my daughter was born in 2016, and I helped give birth to a church in 2015. So this congregation is like my middle child, that I just adore. I'm just so proud of who she is and the people and the work that they continue to do. But I also had been feeling for some time, especially through COVID, that the Lord was beginning to kind of broaden my horizons to see, it's not just, the world doesn't just need one church like this, Michaele. There's a bigger, don't let your focus become so narrow. And so I'm still kind of in a process of discernment about the clarity of next steps. But for the past, I would say, year and a half, a growing sense of urgency and passion for me has been the spiritual well-being of our pastors, mm-hmm. particularly in a continuing and or post-COVID era, whichever you wherever the numbers lie in your current area.
Yeah.
We are just an incredibly exhausted bunch. And there are, tectonic shifts happening within our culture and within the church. And we all know that things are changing more rapidly than we know how to adjust to them. And I think that we are in desperate need of putting our own formation first. And so I feel like there's a work there that I'm being invited to participate in, and I'm trying to be faithful and learn what that looks like in the days ahead.
With that said, hey, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. It has been a joy to get to know you and just bless you in all of your kingdom work, even in the South Bend area. And again, thanks a lot for joining us today.
You're so welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for checking out this podcast. I hope this interview was a blessing to you. Like, share, subscribe, and get the word out. And let's indeed follow Jesus everywhere.